Hi, everyone, and thank you for being with us today on this week's episode of Dual Lessons. We're your host, Miguel,
And I'm Andrea.
and we're going to talk today about loneliness. Loneliness is a topic that, after COVID, has really been on people's radars because so much isolation and just the need to connect with other people. When we think of loneliness, many of us can relate when we've been in relationships where we feel like there's a lack of deep romantic bond, or when we've been to parties that we don't feel that strong friendship. We might feel that in that party is a lot of more superficial kind of activity going on. And then also some of us have lived in communities or been in communities where we kind of felt out of place. So those three different examples I gave you are some of the examples of loneliness that are something we're going to be talking about in this episode, because loneliness is not just one thing. It's on a spectrum, and it just depends on what kind of loneliness. So and loneliness really affects your mental health as well as your physical health in many different examples that we'll be giving in this episode.
Yeah, and there's actually an ongoing study from Harvard that started back in 1938 to learn about what makes people healthy and happy in life. And so it's been tracking several people and their families for decades now. And one of the most interesting findings so far is that having close friendships is a stronger predictor of happiness and health than wealth or social class. And so today we're going to be talking about how loneliness is the most terrible form of poverty when you think about it, and how you're really only as rich as your connection to others is strong and consistent. But as usual, before we start, let's ground ourselves to the present moment and form an inner connection first. And if you guys want to fast forward to the grounding technique for today, jump ahead to minute 4:30 and join us back in the conversation. Today's grounding technique is a quick way to check in with ourselves and our perception of our relationships. We often tend to take our partner or our family or our friends for granted. At times, it can be difficult to accept the support and the love that we do get from them because we're stuck in old stressors or things that bother us about them. So today, let's focus on the good about our loved ones through this meditation. First, close your eyes and imagine yourself sitting on the beach. As the waves come in and out, let's take a few deep breaths. Inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. Inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. Now keep breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. As you sit on the beach, you notice that the sun begins to set on the horizon. As the sun drops closer and closer towards the edge of the water, think about putting all of the negative things that you feel towards the loved one on the sun. Put all the regret, the resentment, the grudges, the blaming, all of those annoyances, put all of these things on the sun as it continues to go lower and lower, disappearing on the horizon. As the sun finally sets and you're now sitting in the moonlight, think about all the things that make you feel grateful for your loved one. All of the things that you have accomplished with their support. All of the positives and the blessings you have as a result of that relationship. And feel free to come back to this meditation whenever you're feeling the need to let the sun set those negative stressors in your relationships that keep you from fully appreciating the people around you.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Now that we're grounded, let's talk about loneliness. But let me start off with the question. So, what age group do you think experiences the most loneliness? So, the three options are older adults above 65, middle aged people from 65 to early 60s, or young adults under 35. Well, the answer is actually young adults, with 61% reporting they feel miserable levels of loneliness. And I know if you're like me, you probably assumed, oh, it has to be the old folks. They have, less things to do, less connections, they're retired. And so they should be more isolated. It makes sense, right? But I mean, surprising to me that young adults, I think full of life and able to make more connections because they have more stuff they're doing. Yet they're the loneliest group of people. And I think the pandemic has a lot to do with this in the last couple years. And if not, the pandemic just showed us how bad we are at connection. I think there was always issues. It showed the issues right up front in front of your face. When we think of loneliness, we don't really think of issues that it can cause down the road with chronic issues. But like we did kind of discuss in the social anxiety episode 3, connection is really more about the quality of the connection than just you have 10 friends, you have 20 friends, so the person that has 20 has, better connection with other people. And the thing is, if we don't really assess what kind of connections we have with people, and if those connections or lack of is causing us to feel lonely inside, we can start having issues with mental health. Like I mentioned earlier in the episode, anxiety, depression, even possible panic attack. And the other part, like everything, is a lot of the physical issues we see in society can be attributed to a lot of the foundation coming from mental health issues that haven't been addressed. So with loneliness, studies have shown people can get heart disease, cognitive decline, and early death.
I was going to interrupt you. I think that's a really good point, and you made me think of something. So I remember seeing this, like, honestly, firsthand during the worst of COVID. Everyone was feeling isolated and alone without their families or friends being able to visit them in the hospital. And in many cases, patients were already depressed or anxious because they were hospitalized, right? And then it gets paired with this isolation from their support network. And I remember a lot of them just making poor choices regarding their treatment plans simply because they didn't want to be in the hospital. They wanted to leave the earliest possible, even if it put them at risk for like poor health outcomes later down the road. And I'm never going to forget, I had one patient, he had such a strong bond with his wife. Like, she would come see him every day before the pandemic, of course, when it was possible. And she was just very supportive of him during his treatment with chemotherapy. And so the moment things got more complicated and like family visitation stopped, he grew more and more depressed each day that passed. He also experienced side effects, unfortunately, from the chemo that kind of kept him admitted longer than what was initially planned. And so every day that passed, he would grow more and more restless and frustrated because he was there, and he was there without his family or even being able to talk to them. I literally had to talk him into staying, not leaving against, against medical advice. He was just so devastated when he had to spend his anniversary in the hospital because he just felt so alone and isolated. And although, of course, like I tried to be supportive and like be there for him and talk to him, there's just nothing like the feeling of being heard and understood by your loved ones or by your connections. And so, yes, loneliness is a serious matter with significant implications. And when we have a high proportion of our younger population, like you mentioned earlier, experiencing this, it makes me think about like, what are we doing wrong in society that has led us to this point of just like epidemic disconnection, if you really think about it, right?
Yeah, I remember actually one day I got floated down to your unit and I took care of that patient. And it was just, just really heartbreaking situation. I remember him just feeling so depressed and lonely because he just had no physical connection with the family. And, as nurses, we always try to put out fires in different ways by different tools. So with him, it was, we try to, try to encourage him on phone calls and do the best. But I mean, when you talk to someone on the phone, it's just not the same as having that connection. I mean, this is something that, like, even with my own experience with loneliness, I mentioned to you of like calling my parents is just not the same as like how it used to be when I lived close to them, that I can just drive, be there for an hour, and go on my day. So
That physical presence, right?
exactly, where you can see their reaction, see how they're responding. So I think this really just this story you mentioned really shows us that loneliness, it comes in different shapes and sizes. Like I mentioned, it's kind of on a spectrum. It's not just you're lonely or you're not, like black and white mentality, right? People can be in a full room of others that they know and they feel lonely. They could be around family and friends and they feel lonely. And they could be married or dating someone and maybe they should be the happiest for many reasons, but they're lonely. So lonely is just a subjective experience. And I think a way we can think of loneliness is that feeling you get of the gap that exists between where you are connection is with someone else, whether in a relationship or a friendship, and where it should be or where you want it to be. So that feeling of loneliness is kind of like the gap, right? So the less lonely you feel with someone, then that means the more connected you are with them. And I mean, I have a perfect example. I mean, you and me have been down this journey of of being married and being in school and, trying to achieve certain goals that we have. And yeah, at times, like, we've been together more as a couple than probably most or any of my friendships or couple friends that I know. And at times, myself, I felt still disconnected because I didn't have the opportunity to be around family and friends that I used to be when I lived back in Washington State. So I felt that lack of social connection with them, and it led me at times to just feel depressed. And I remember after going to couples therapy with you, I then, by the help of the therapist and you mentioning things, it really came to realization that you also felt lonely, even though you were in a similar situation to me of like, well, I have my spouse there, they're always around, and I always have someone I can bounce off ideas, someone that cares for me. Yet you still felt kind of disconnected and also and lonely, and you felt maybe that loneliness was due also to me feeling lonely and not paying as much attention to you, right? Because if someone has a lot of feelings of loneliness, well, they're going to be less connected to other people, less involved in daily things. They're going to feel like, well, I'm feeling down, I don't feel like doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's true. And it did take me a while to realize that that's what was happening, but you're absolutely right. There was like a loneliness in the marriage that I think you also felt, like you mentioned, simply because we were both like in a bad spot and we were neglecting each other, and like kind of we talked about in episode 2. But this just proves that even like with friends and family, we can feel lonely. We can also feel lonely if we feel unwanted or rejected, like in a breakup or divorce, or if a friendship ends too, right? Some of us might be more prone to feeling lonely too if we have trouble forming close relationships, or if we're a little higher on like the narcissistic scale and it's a little harder for others to connect with us because of our personality traits. Others of us tend to have mindsets that just set us up to feel lonely, like being overly critical of ourselves or others and tending to expect rejection. Which makes sense because if you expect to be unwanted, why put yourself out there for connection, right? It's kind of a self fulfilling prophecy of loneliness. And some of us might not even be aware that that's what's happening. We might blame depression or anxiety or being overwhelmed or too busy to connect with people. Or honestly, just flat out blame other people for not reaching out to us, right? But I think we all need to become more aware of what we're experiencing in order to be able to address it. And there are several loneliness questionnaires out there to help you assess what you're feeling. But the one I find really thorough and helpful is the UCLA Loneliness Scale that tries to capture someone's extent of disconnection and social isolation. We've uploaded a copy of the scale on our site, jointhelessons.com, under the podcast tab, or follow the link in the description of this episode. But like usual, guys, with any other resources we share, this is for educational purposes only. It's not going to provide any diagnostic value. And if you suspect you're struggling a little more with loneliness or social isolation, we highly recommend you follow up with like some loneliness strategies that we'll discuss later in this episode, or even reach out to a mental health professional for more support.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil those questions, but I really hope people take the time to do that UCLA loneliness scale, because some of those questions might actually hit home. At least for me, they did. And I don't know. I'm starting to think about when we talked about the young adults and the loneliness and kind of the surprise to myself and to most people. I really can relate to being at that age and having that feeling of loneliness and not having that connection. I remember when I moved to Los Angeles and later went through a divorce, and I started feeling lonely. And I was away from my family. I did have a cousin in LA who was somewhat close, like an hour away. But it's just that feeling of loneliness that you're not around the people that you used to be, that you were close to, and that you connected with.
Or people checking in on you too, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, in sales, it was the whole, if you're not in front of someone, they're gonna forget about you kind of thing. It's kind of the same thing, right? If they're not close enough for them to visit you, then after a while, only so many phone calls come through. And I remember it wasn't really until I got a roommate and he invited me to some support group. And at that point, I didn't know anything about mental health. I didn't know really much about psychology to some extent. So I didn't really know it was a support group until later that I started feeling a connection, because it ended up being a group for people that had gone through issues. And just from the first or second session of going there, it was kind of an open group. It was actually free. Hearing other people's issues and then me being able to talk about my issues, you felt a sense of connection with the other people of like, hey, we're all struggling through things. We all, these issues are normal to some extent. So I really felt some connection there in that part of my life that I needed. And then later I moved to Houston. My best friend and his wife were living here, so I kind of followed after I came to visit. But there was still times that I felt lonely here. Again, from being far away from family and the sense of every time you move, big moves, you kind of start from scratch. And then just, still having burden of some of issues with the divorce and just emotional drainage I hadn't really processed. But I mean, and thankfully that extrovert personality I have kind of helped me, and it still helped me at times because it really pushed me when I first had moved to Houston to put myself out there, go to meetup groups, hang out with friends from work, and little by little I just started feeling more connected, and that loneliness kind of went away. But again, sometimes it comes and I feel lonely. Obviously, when we're stressed, we're doing a lot of activities and we can't do the stuff we enjoy or hang out with the people we want, we can start feeling lonely. And then you feel disconnected again. And it's just a cycle of like you feel connected and you don't. And it's really about, I don't ever want to feel lonely. It's not really that. It's more about how can I keep this? How can I maintain and feel more connected to people by the things that I do? So, the pandemic has really made it in front of our face that if you don't connect with people and if you don't keep up with those connections, you will feel isolated. And I think even as a nurse working at the hospital, we felt many times isolated because it was just the patients there and then you go home.
Especially because obviously we had to kind of self-isolate to not get other people we care about sick or potentially risk exposing them. So yeah, that was definitely hard on a different level for, I feel like, a lot of healthcare workers. But it's really sad sometimes to think about when it's not due to external factors, how loneliness can really be self-inflicted. Oftentimes because we don't know how to speak up about feeling disconnected in our current relationships, or we feel rejection if we try to form new ones. I remember feeling, for me, significant time periods as well in my life where I just felt really disconnected, misunderstood in my relationships at the time. The most impactful for me, though, was during a time when I was 21 and I actually lived in Mexico as kind of a step in my immigration process. And as a young adult, insecure, fear of rejection, feeling completely unseen in a city that I hadn't lived for in more than 10 years, forming connections was just even more difficult than what I was used to here in Houston, especially with social anxiety, of course, and hypersensitivity to rejection that comes with that. And so it was difficult for me to even just reach out. It was a very difficult year of my life where I felt so disconnected from friends and family and struggled with significant depression and even some suicidal ideation. And I didn't even realize that, honestly, until I read back, a journal that I was keeping at the time. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I had suicidal ideation. And I think if it hadn't been for the love and support that I felt from my mom and the connection she gave me, I would have been in complete isolation. And so I eventually made it back to Houston and slowly but surely began connecting again. But I noticed I struggled a lot with opening myself up to people. I felt very just socially awkward, and I felt like I had lost the social skills that I needed, and then again, I had like social anxiety. And so that just completely took over. It's just really crazy to see how impactful loneliness was on my overall mental and physical health. Although I wasn't the healthiest before moving down there, I definitely came back with a weight gain of 20 pounds and just a full-blown eating disorder, like full-blown. It's like I literally moved from one significant mental health problem into another that also took significant time to heal from.
Yeah, it's just sad to hear you say all that because it's sad, but it's also important that you share those stories because I think we need to talk more about loneliness, and which is why we're doing this episode, but also for other people to share, the time that they have felt lonely with other people so that we can all learn from each other and really help us recognize, when someone is lonely that, here's what you could do in the future if it happens again. And just the need, like with anything with mental health, is just speak up. And you need to speak up to be heard from others. And this issue is actually very common in society, especially in the US. There's actually a book I want to recommend for listeners. It's called Together by the US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. He's actually was a previous Surgeon General for Obama and actually now for Biden. And he actually went around the US and talked about loneliness. He mentioned a couple in Alabama. I remember that they lost their son to opioid addiction, and nobody really after the overdose really asked them how they felt. And these were people that before they would talk to on a daily basis. I remember how he explained how that story made the couple feel really lonely because they felt like maybe their friends didn't want to ask because they didn't want to get those feelings to come up again, but not talking to them made them feel really lonely and isolated from the community that they had been around, living for such a long time. And then also remember there was another story about it, some executive in Los Angeles who spent his birthday alone because he pretty much worked so much. He was a workaholic that it became to the point where he lost connection with all his friends. And later he developed issues with anxiety and depression because he just had a fear that no one was going to, like, if no one was there for his birthday, what would that say about future events? And I remember there's a research study too where it showed that people with weaker relationships or more social isolation are 50% more likely to die early than those with strong relationships.
And that makes a lot of sense because, as we mentioned before in episode 3 about social anxiety, being connected to others was essential back, when we were still developing, in a sense, in order to have a safe and secure life in a world full of predators, right? While having limited protection. And so if our ancestor felt isolated or alone, it was a major threat, and their nervous system responded with that fight or flight response to help them become more alert of any possible threat while they were alone. And that makes sense, right? And so in that anxious state of self-preservation, any idea of relaxation for them was out the door. They're not thinking about, let me go, relax or hang out with people. It was like, I'm alone, I'm about to get eaten. Like I'm very hyped up and alert and being aware of what's going on in my surroundings, right? You're very tense and the nervous system is very active.
Yeah, and I think we think of modern technology and how much it's advanced, and now we're in 2022. But we forget that we have that same wiring from back then. So if we're in a situation of feeling that anxious state, you're not going to want to do any leisure activities, and you're going to almost isolate even more, which is going to cause more loneliness, and you're going to sink further into that hole. And you start having these automatic wiring response, automatic thoughts, right? Of like, I need to protect myself, so I need to just not talk to other people and focus on my issues right now. But you're doing it by yourself, which is making you even more lonely.
Yeah, and so we've been talking about this, loneliness is experienced by everyone, and so some degree of how we respond to it has a lot to do with this evolutionary passed down effect of responses. But another important factor for loneliness is our attachment style and how much it can influence the extent of and interpretation of loneliness. So what is attachment style? Attachment style describes the way in which we approach our social interactions and our relationships. And we can literally spend an entire episode dedicated to attachment theory, but I want to just sum up the most crucial points here. Our attachment style can give us insight into how we trust others, how well we share our experiences with other people, and how receptive we are to give and to take emotional support. And if we're able to self-soothe our emotions or not. And there are 4 main types of attachments that have certain characteristics. Someone may have evidence of all of those characteristics under a specific style or just some of them. But ultimately, overall, our attachment style is a makeup of percentages of how much we are of each type. And so the different types include anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure. But for the purpose of loneliness, we're going to focus on the anxious and the avoidant types. The anxious types often want closeness in their relationships, but they're worried about other people leaving or about just losing that relationship. And so they experience a negative perception of themselves and a positive perception of others. The avoidant is typically self-sufficient. They don't initiate nor seek deep relationships, and they tend to avoid emotional intimacy. Avoidant types tend to have a negative perception of others, but a positive perception of themselves. And for comparison to what baseline would be per se, the secure type tends to be comfortable in relationships and intimacy and is self-confident, self-secure. Secure types tend to have a positive view of themselves and of other people. And so how do anxious or avoidant attachment styles relate to loneliness? Well, it turns out that the way we interact with others and the style of relationships that we prefer can impact our experience with loneliness. Those that tend to have more anxious attachment styles, they rely a lot on emotional support and closeness in their relationships. But if they don't get it for whatever reason, they're going to end up feeling emotionally lonely and deprived of support. On the other hand, the avoidant types tend to have fewer friends, and in romantic relationships, they don't look for depth or intimacy, and actually they can feel threatened by it. So they tend to be critical of their partners and may even subconsciously sabotage relationships, which can lead to having really short or casual relationships that eventually can lead to feeling socially isolated or lonely because they're not engaging with people or having deep connections, even though that's kind of what they seek in a sense. There is no one size fits all to this though, and it can take a lot of, introspection and self reflection to really identify what our needs are. But once we do become more aware, we can put strategies to help us address the patterns or behaviors that lead to loneliness. And so there is an attachment style quiz that you can take to help you learn what your attachment preferences are and then evaluate how your attachment style influences your experience or perception of loneliness, whether it's emotional loneliness or social loneliness. And you can find the questionnaire and the study that validated it on our site at jointolessons.com under the podcast tab and files. But again, please remember, this is for educational purposes only.
And once you know your attachment style, now it's the hard work. It's time to take action. Like we said, knowledge is not power. Knowledge plus action equals actual power. So now it's time to take action to confront that loneliness that you're feeling. So one of the steps you can do is the practice of gratitude, which is just reevaluating those relationships you have currently and being appreciative that you've had those relationships, touch bases with those people, see how they're doing, start investing in those relationships. If for some reason it's a relationship that you really appreciated, but you can't do that anymore, then it's really about having the gratitude of being mindful of that experience you got to feel with that person, and then just really focusing on gratitude on a more daily basis, because that can help with you to become more optimistic with any future relationships that you have. So that gratitude you had from the past ones can help you with the future ones, and really helps you to form a closeness in relationships that is really what's going to help you to get away from feeling lonely. Another tip is really to consider, what do you value? Like, what are your values? Because your values and really living a life that fulfills those values is what's going to help you with the friendships that you connect with. It's going to help you with a lot of direction you take your life in. And it can really help you to avoid those scenarios of feeling lonely because you're around the wrong people that don't have the same values that you have. A good way to do that is find groups that have some common bond in what you're interested in, such as maybe a sports team or a book club. Maybe you like reading mystery stories. Or volunteering. Maybe you have a certain cause that you're really passionate about. So finding people that you can connect with over that volunteer, or even some people do fitness groups like running clubs. Really, it comes down to anything that creates connection around a specific topic that you care about. But overall, we all understand we long for connection, and we also need to understand that there's going to be at times where loneliness might come in. But one of the ways is just important to recognize your values, recognize the level of emotion you need from other people, because we all have different levels of emotion requirements that we have. And then be self-reflecting about your relationships. How are you with other people is going to affect how you get the response from those people. But as a reminder, check out the list of resources for loneliness that we put together on our site at jointolessons.com to help you become more aware of how you experience loneliness and what you can do to confront it. We hope you've found this episode helpful, but it's also important to note that what we talked about today may or may not relate to you and your circumstance. You are the only person that can decide what is the best approach to your mental well-being, so we encourage you to reflect on this topic some more, practice being self-aware, and seek professional help when appropriate for your circumstance.
Well, everyone, that wraps up today's episode about loneliness. Thank you so much for joining us this week. And as a reminder, you can check out any of the handouts we talked about or the resources under the podcast tab or by following the links in the description of this episode.
Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can receive new episodes right when they're released. You can either subscribe right now in the app you're listening to this podcast, or you can sign up for email alerts at jointolessons.com. We also love to hear your thoughts about today's episode. Please leave a comment or send us a DM on what really stuck out to you or what we missed that's important about this topic.
Thank you again for joining us in this episode of Dual Essence. Next week, we'll be talking about self-esteem. We've all heard about the fake it till you make it and how self-affirmations can help you accomplish difficult goals. But what exactly does it mean to have or lack self-esteem? Next week, we'll talk about how self-acceptance and self-responsibility can build us up, and how recognizing our values and living by them can propel our confidence and happiness. Tune in next week for a talk about self-esteem. For now, take care and talk to you next time.